Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods, and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Leadership Podcast, where we explore ideas, policies, and innovation shaping our climate future. In today's episode, we focus on one of the fastest evolving areas in corporate sustainability, which is sustainability reporting. As investors, regulators, and stakeholders demand greater transparency, organizations are facing growing pressure to disclose how sustainability issues affect their businesses. New frameworks such as CSRD, ESRS, ISSB, and emerging UK sustainability reporting standards are reshaping reporting expectations across industries. For many organizations, the challenge is no longer whether to report, but how to prepare for an increasingly complex reporting landscape. To help us understand what lies ahead, I'm joined today by Mr. Richard Betts, Sustainability and Climate Advisor, founder of RZB Advisory, and former partner at EY and ERM. Richard has spent more than 2 decades advising multinational organizations on sustainability strategy, climate risk, ESG reporting, and regulatory readiness across the UK, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. Richard, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Amber. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Okay, so before we begin, could you briefly share your professional journey and how you became involved in sustainability reporting and climate advisory?
Yeah, happily. So as you touched on, my career now covers more than 2 decades. I've only worked in the area of sustainability since 2010, although my first few years prior to that were actually in sort of financial reporting and audit with KPMG. But in 2010, I reconnected with my undergrad and master's had been, geography, but the main focus had been climate change, environmental change. And so in 2010, I had the opportunity to transfer to what was then a very small climate change KPMG in London. Since then I haven't looked back. It's the only thing I've worked on, and over that time I've got to work with lots of large organizations, FTSE 100, Fortune 500, also a lot of smaller startup type companies in the UK, but also extensively over internationally. A lot of time in Europe, Asia. We were based in Turkey for 8 years, working up with the Americas as well. So a lot of global experience, and across areas of sustainability, a lot on reporting, a lot on sort of assurance, but also sort of strategy, climate advisory, nature more recently. Worked for 3 of the big 4, and as you touched on, I now run my own advisory company.
Right. Okay, Richard, let's get started. So sustainability reporting has evolved rapidly over the last decade. What do you see as the biggest changes driving this transformation?
Yeah, so I think clearly a lot's happened over that time. I think one sort of fundamental shift that we've seen has been that there's been this move away from voluntary sustainability reporting increasingly to mandatory sustainability reporting, and touch to sort of some of the standards and frameworks that you mentioned. We've seen the emergence of a lot of sustainability related standards, regulations, frameworks in various parts of the world, which are now mandatory for many companies. And linked to that, we've seen this move from companies preparing their voluntary reports, often in terms of like a standalone sustainability report, to needing to include those sustainability related disclosures in their main business report, in their annual report. So voluntary to mandatory, and a more formal process now in the business report, more scrutiny from key stakeholders, increasingly external assurance, starting to see sort of more integration with the financial data, and really underpinning all of this is increased sort of realization that sustainability data risks and opportunities are increasingly sort of business risks and opportunities, and hence the need for it to be prepared on a mandatory standardized basis.
Right. So Richard, have you seen that companies who do not produce these reports are have some negative advantage in the market?
No, I think I mean there's a spectrum. So all each company will have has a sort of a slightly different sort of situation. But I think for many companies, certainly for many large companies, good quality sustainability data is demanded, increasingly expected by a wide range of stakeholders. So no, I think in most cases it meets sort of those stakeholder demands, and secondly, can be a way to stand out against competition, competitors who aren't able to sort of report in a sort of transparent way with robust data.
Okay, so we hear a lot about CSRD, ESRS, ISSB, and UK sustainability reporting standard. How do these frameworks differ, and what should organizations focus
on? Well, I think the first point is a company needs to understand, its specific context for reporting. What is relevant to the organization, because with the ones you just mentioned, they have different sort of focuses in terms of graphical focus, also in terms of stakeholder focus. So, for example, the EU CSRD, ESRS standards primarily focus on an EU audience, although, yes, there is an element of extraterritoriality whereby, large companies that do a lot of trade with the EU, for example, can also be impacted. So that sort of global dimension, but the first focus is less the EU. You mentioned the UK, the new UK standards. Obviously, their focus is mainly UK, and then we've got the global IFRS sustainability standards, which a lot of jurisdictions around the world have now starting locally and sort of transposing those global standards into their national reporting requirements. Like in the UK, the UK's new standards are the UK's sort of tailored version of those global IFRS standards. So basically, a company needs to understand what is relevant to it and where. So looking at the different jurisdictions where a company operates, which standards and frameworks are relevant, which are relevant now, which are relevant sort of in the coming years, which are sort of mandatory, which are sort of are optional. So that it needs to sort of understand all those sort of points as part of that, that relevance exercise, and and connected to that, a company should, does need to do a comprehensive materiality assessment with a lot of stakeholder engagement to understand what are the key expectations, concerns, what's material for different sort of stakeholder groups, what's material for terms of sustainability, and that the topics that a company needs to report on. So, for example, if a company's in scope of the EU's sustainability standards, those ESRS standards, it will do that double materiality assessment. If that identifies, let's say, biodiversity as being material, then it needs to report on the biodiversity standard. So, in summary, it needs to sort of look at, understand its context, what's relevant and where, and then it needs to do that materiality analysis to understand, specifically which topics, which issues it needs to focus on.
Right. So, Richard, in one of the projects which I was doing at Imperial, we were analyzing beer companies, and we had like 4 or 5 different beer companies like Heineken, Carlsberg, stuff like that. So we were reading their sustainability reports. So what we found was the structure was pretty different. Like there was no common structure, like in a financial document or financial numbers, you see balance sheet and everything is structured. But in sustainability, that is still not the case. And it's a problem for a reader who is first time reading it. So do you think there is no structure yet, or there is some structure? What is your views?
I think a lot's been happening, and linked to what we discussed a few minutes ago about how we see this trend away from voluntary reporting to more mandatory reporting. Linked to that, we can see a move towards standardization. Basically the reporting is becoming more formal, and it's moving closer to the financial reporting world. So for example, large companies in the EU, soon in the UK, have to prepare disclosures, pretty prescriptive disclosures in a lot of cases, whereby they'll all have to prepare the same. The ones in scope will all have to prepare the same sort of material disclosures against the same standards. In some cases, like in the EU, they have to obtain external assurance of those disclosures. And then that all has to be in their main business report. So that's definitely increasing the standardization. But still, there are some differences, because I think, you mentioned the financial reporting. Obviously, there are some differences there, but the differences are bigger in sustainability, because the issues are can be with some companies needing to report on biodiversity, others needing to report on pollution, others needing to report on some other topic. So that obviously makes it harder to benchmark against all companies. But I think this move towards more formalized reporting, more prescriptive reporting, is certainly it is increasing, and it will increase further the standardization and the comparability between reporters, at least from from the same sector.
Right. Okay. So, Richard, many companies are trying to understand where to start. So, what are the most common mistakes organizations make when preparing new reporting requirements?
Well, I think one key point, again building on what we were talking about a few minutes ago, is the importance of doing a comprehensive materiality assessment. Part of that, to undertake comprehensive sort of stakeholder engagement with sort of the key stakeholder groups, because I think one thing I've seen is often companies will have strong relations with their sort of conventional stakeholders for their financial reporting, with investors and regulators, but when it comes to sustainability, in many cases, there's a broader range of stakeholders that are often very interested in what a company is doing or not doing in areas like climate action and so on. So NGOs, activists, academics. So there's a wide range of stakeholder groups there potentially, and I think in some cases companies haven't sort of those different stakeholder groups, and then they've prepared a report, or they've made a commitment or a claim, and that hasn't gone down well with certain stakeholders, and there's been plenty of acts of greenwashing and controversies in recent years. And I think in some cases it's because a company didn't, often well-intentioned, sort of to a new initiative without sort of fully understanding expectations from its different stakeholder groups, in some cases from new stakeholders. And so that's just some sort of negative pushback. And I think this then links to a second point, which is in terms of the limitations with data. Many companies have been preparing, have had to collect types of data. For the first time, data that hasn't been sort of scrutinized internally previously, so that often leads to sort of a lot of issues around data not being very robust, not being sort of very complete, data not being very accurate, and the need for sort of estimation, and so lots of errors linked to sort of the quality of the data. And a lot of good things are happening. There's a lot of good initiatives. A lot of companies have made huge improvements, and with all the standards and tools and resources and new sort of tech resources that we see, that's all sort of greatly helping to improve the quality of the data. But nevertheless, in many cases, maturity is at a lower level than in sort of the financial reporting world, and so that often leads to lots of issues around lack of completion, lack of comparability, and so on.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned about data. I was also thinking about the incoming of AI. So many a times we ask AI, but we don't know if the source they are using is credible or not. So how, as a professional, you deal with this kind of understanding?
Yeah, so I think obviously AI, gives us and new tech solutions more broadly. They give us great new opportunities, but also sort of some new risks. So I think in terms of data collection, really the focus needs to be on in many cases on sort of on augmentation, whereby it's a combination of human expertise and insight, and these new tech solutions. Because what you touched on, of course, the quality of any data output, can only ever be as good as the quality of the input in the first place. And of course, in the area of sustainability, a lot of companies don't have complete data. They don't have data from all their locations, from all their facilities, for all their different sustainability areas. And so if what they have is what's used in a new system, then of course it's going to have limitations because it was never complete in the first place. So there is a need, increased need between humans and the new sort of tech solutions to make sure that the data is as credible throughout the journey, and certainly from the initial onboarding.
Right. Also, Richard, thinking about scope 3, which can run deep into the supply chain with multiple producers, like you said, different countries, might not even have data. So what steps can companies take to gather this kind of information?
I mean, it links to sort of another sort of key issue in terms of data fragmentation, and with sustainability in terms of emissions reporting, a lot of companies have got a good sort of core emissions, their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions data, but scope 3 is an earlier stage for most companies still, and because there are sort of potentially so many providers that they need to sort of source data from, and hence the need to sort of collaborate with needs to sort of get better data. And so I think so that's a journey. That's something that needs to be sort of worked on over time. But I mean, quick wins would be to sort of do like a segmentation, to look at a company's supply chain, and identify hotspots in terms of the emission sources. So which scope 3 categories are most material, and also which suppliers, which locations are most material, and then to start there, and then to sort of look to sort of fill in the gaps over time, but to first do that sort of the hotspotting, segmentation, hotspotting, deep dive on those sort of most material locations, and look to sort of then roll out the learnings from those locations where a sort of in-depth analysis has been done to other places, and to sort of to build those, to fill in those gaps over time. And so I think that's sort of that's a key thing that companies should focus on initially.
Right. Okay. So sustainability assurance is becoming increasingly important. Why does assurance matter, and how do you see it evolving in the future?
Yeah, so I think for the same reason that that an external audit is important in the financial reporting world. It's essential for trust and for credibility. They're both for internal stakeholders. So when it can be demonstrated that the data is credible, then a company can then sort of move towards more strategic activities, because it can then set meaningful targets for how it's going to sort of drive performance improvement. Without robust data, without data that can be shown to be credible, then there's obviously a question mark as to whether any sort of targets, even if they seem very ambitious, whether they're the right targets, because there'll be question marks over the the performance to date. So it's essential for those reasons. Assurance is going to evolve. Well, linked to what we were talking about, how we can see this move from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting to more formal reporting. I mean, there's similarly in terms of assurance. We can see in some cases it's now mandatory for companies to obtain external assurance. For example, in the European Union, so all those thousands of companies that have to prepare their sustainability reports in line with the CSRD external assurance on all their sustainability disclosures. So mandatory there. So that's sort of one, and I think that will become increasingly common elsewhere, but mandatory in the EU. I mean, up until most external assurance for sustainability has been at a limited assurance level. So that's essentially like a negative opinion, where the auditor, the assurance provider, gives and the lines of based on all the work they did, there was no evidence of a material unstated error or omission in the data. But the higher level, so the level of in financial reporting is a sort of the reasonable assurance, which is essentially a positive opinion where the auditor agrees with management's, with the company's data. But to get to that higher level, there's the need for sort of robust data. There's a need for sort of a lot more in terms of testing, bigger sample sizes, bigger projects, and I think as sustainability is increasingly seen as core business, then larger companies are sort of moving towards reasonable assurance. So I think that's another trend, and I think that will be facilitated by the enhancements we see in the tech world with AI, with the possibility for auditors to move sort of more quickly and in sort of more detail. So that's a way I think to sort of we can expect to see assurance evolving, facilitated by the developments in AI.
Okay. Richard, I was just thinking, like, if a company says we'll get to net zero by 2040 or 2045, and they did not, so is there any legal action can be taken against them, or is it all voluntary?
Well, I think it would depend on. I mean, there's certainly fallout. That company needs to be aware of. I mean, I think that touch on what we were saying earlier, though. I think some companies did sort of rush to make commitments, such as in terms of without fully understanding the expectations, maybe because their data wasn't that robust, for all these sort of connected reasons that we've been talking about. And of course, we have seen headwinds recently with sort of some pushback, some sort of cooling in a lot of different places. So I think that's all important sort of context, really. But sustainability reporting is sort of is a sort of a less mature area than sort of financial. It is more common for data to be restated, for commitments to be sort of updated, because as a company's understanding and capabilities have changed, have evolved, that makes things more possible. But normally it's to sort of be able to hopefully raise the bar rather than lower the bar. But I think what is increasingly expected is the need for companies to prepare and disclose their transition plan for how they're going to get to net zero. And we've seen some very standards, frameworks linked to sort of transition planning for years, and that's sort of how we're moving. So the next stage was linked to sort of setting a goal, setting a target, communicating the goal or target. Now we move to sort of the, in some ways, the harder bit, sort of the implement. And that's where a lot of the scrutiny has moved. Sort of, stakeholders wanting to know, well, how are you going to get to net zero, and what's it going to mean for the company's future prospects? What does it mean, sort of capital reallocation? So that's where a lot of the scrutiny is. So and that's going to intensify, right? So companies will be investors, other stakeholders will be looking at those transition plans or lack of transition plan to sort of to assess the credibility of the company's net zero target. Yes.
Yeah, I think because now a framework has been created, like all the stakeholders have a starting point to see how the company is going about.
Yeah.
Richard, I was thinking about this question about nature and biodiversity. So climate-related disclosures have gained significant attention. How do you see nature and biodiversity reporting evolving over the coming years?
Well, I think what we've seen in the last few years is, firstly, heightened awareness that nature risk is a key business risk increasingly. A key risk to all of us, to humanity. I mean, when you look at risk reports, for example, the World Economic Forum's annual report on the top risks to the global economy. I mean, that now shows amongst those top risks over the coming years, nature-related risks as amongst the top risks to the global economy. So there's been this sort of heightened awareness that there's an issue that needs urgent attention. I think in response, we've seen some really great initiatives and resources that have been coming out. So TNFD, for example, initiative I was fortunate to be connected to when that first back in 2017. The companies now have more resources that they can leverage in terms of biodiversity standards frameworks, also new sort of digital tools. This means they can sort of potentially start to move more quickly, and I think, and also not just in terms of nature standards and resources, but also from connected areas like climate change. So I mentioned TNFD. I mean, that's very similar and deliberately so to the climate initiative, the TCFD. The point being that a key goal was to sort of leverage what had already been done in a connected but different area in terms of climate, and to sort of so that companies wouldn't need to start from zero, but they could sort of leverage the sort of the thinking, the resources that had already happened in a sort of connected area. So I think in summary, increased awareness, increased resources that are available, and I think although it's at an earlier stage of maturity than areas like climate, there's the potential to move more quickly because we can sort of draw on those sort of connected resources. But but in addition, we also see how as I said, the overall context is that we're moving from a voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting. I mean, that's also the case with nature. So, for example, in the EU, there is one of the standards is on biodiversity. Others are very sort of connected to biodiversity. But for companies that have those issues as material, it's mandatory for them to report on those sort of nature-related disclosures and to obtain external assurance on those. So that's also going to sort of increase the expectations and demands on companies.
Okay. So finally, Richard, if you could give one piece of advice to organizations preparing for the future of sustainability reporting, what would that be?
Well, I think for organizations, well, I mean, as we said earlier, I think first of all, understand their context, what's relevant to them and where. Do a materiality assessment to understand, where the key issues, and see that not as the end of the journey, because I think sometimes companies sort of did do a materiality assessment because it was mandatory or expected for a report. And then didn't sort of didn't capitalize on sort of the the business value fully from sort of going through that comprehensive process. But by engaging with lots of different stakeholders, by getting data on lots of different areas, that gives a company great intel for where it should focus on, what its risks it can sort of capitalize on going forward. So to sort of see how it can unlock business value. And I think also, the last point, look to network, look to collaborate with others. So many of the sustainability issues that we're faced with, they're systemic. Any one company or any one stakeholder in isolation they require collaboration with sector peers, with other partners. In some cases, companies and stakeholders that companies are already working extensively with, but in some cases, working relations with new stakeholders and forging new collaboration.
Okay, so thank you, Richard, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us today. It is clear sustainability reporting is becoming far more than a compliance exercise. It is increasingly shaping how organizations manage risk, engage stakeholders, and create long-term value. Thank you for joining us and for contributing to this important discussion. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow the Climate Leadership Podcast for more conversations with leaders shaping the future of climate, business, and sustainability. Until next time, take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.